Hello and welcome. In this explainer, we're going to dig into a feeling that I think a lot of us have right now, this widespread anxiety, this sense that the systems we all count on are just strained, maybe even starting to break. We're going to peel back the layers of this crisis, kind of like an onion, and follow the thread from the economy all the way down to the very nature of power itself. So let's just start with a really direct question that hits home for a lot of people. Does the economy feel broken to you? I mean, for millions of us, the answer is a huge yes. It's that feeling of instability, right? Like you're running faster and faster on a treadmill just to stay in the same spot. But is that just a feeling, or is there some cold, hard data to back it up? Well, let's put a number to that feeling. According to the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, U.S. GDP growth was literally cut in half in just 1 year. It dropped all the way down to just 1%. Now, a slowdown that fast, that drastic, that's a huge red flag that something is seriously wrong under the hood. Yeah, that 1% figure, that's just a symptom of a much bigger illness. To really get what's going on, we need to start with the most obvious warning signs. This is us peeling back that first layer of the problem. And before we go any further, let's just get on the same page with a key term here. The source material defines a recession pretty simply. It's a period of economic contraction. Basically, the economy is shrinking instead of growing. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at the signs. So, what are those classic telltale signs? Well, the sources we looked at point to this three-step pattern that seems to be playing out right now. First, you get rate cuts. The idea is to make borrowing cheaper so people spend more. Then, step two, as demand for stuff keeps falling anyway, you start to see job losses. And finally, step three, the government steps in with things like tax cuts to try and jumpstart the whole engine again. Okay, now here's where things get really interesting, and we start to go a bit deeper. What if all these problems, what if they aren't just a temporary bug in the system? The source material makes a really compelling argument that what we're actually seeing is a feature of a huge, fundamental clash between two completely opposite economic philosophies. And this brings us to the core of that conflict. On one side, you've got what the sources call the Western economy of scarcity. This model is all about making money from money. Financialization, driving up the value of existing things like stocks and real estate. But on the other side, you have China's economy of abundance, which is focused on actually building things, generating wealth through real production, new infrastructure, and manufacturing. One source uses a really powerful, kind of provocative term for this Western model, a mafioso economy. Now, what does that mean? It describes a system where wealth isn't created, it's extracted. Think about it like this. You used to buy a piece of software one time, and you owned it. Now you have to pay a monthly subscription forever for that same product. They're just extracting more money without actually creating more value. And to see this in action, just look at this number. $945 billion. That's how much money Apple has spent on stock buybacks since 2012. Now, instead of using that capital to build new factories or fund game-changing R&D, it was used to make existing shares more valuable for stockholders. It's a perfect example of that financialization model winning out over actual production. And the result of these two competing models in the real world? Well, it's pretty stark. Look at this. By 2024, China's manufacturing output is now greater than the US, the EU, and Japan combined. This isn't just a small gap, people. This is a massive structural shift in who is actually building the world's stuff. This huge difference in economic philosophy has consequences that go way beyond just what's made in a factory. As the sources argue, a nation's economic model has a direct, and I mean direct, impact on its geopolitical power and its military strength. I mean, just look at this number, 240 times. According to admissions from the U.S. Navy that were cited in one source, China now has 240 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. Think about that. In any potential conflict, the ability to build and replace ships is absolutely critical. This one statistic reveals a mind-boggling gap in industrial power. This new reality is forcing a really radical debate inside the U.S. This quote here from businessman and ambassador nominee Howard Lutnick just lays it bare. People are actually asking, should the U.S. government start taking ownership stakes in critical companies like Boeing? It's a move that sources describe as a slide toward a state-directed economy, which is pretty ironic, considering that's the very model it's supposed to be competing against. So if you can't outproduce your rivals, what's plan B? Well, one source argues that the US is now pursuing a strategy of disruption. The idea is to try and slow down Asia's economic rise by destabilizing key trade routes and regions, basically preventing a powerful, unified economic bloc from ever fully forming. All right, so we've looked at the symptoms, we've looked at the diagnosis, and we've seen the geopolitical fallout. But all of this leads to the final, and honestly, the most challenging layer of this whole thing. If the system seems to be failing even by its own rules, is someone still in control? The sources we've looked at dive right into this question, and it is so important to say we're just presenting these perspectives as they appear in the sources, we're not endorsing them. One concept that comes up is technocracy. The sources define this as a system of governance run by technical experts, not politicians. It's described as the science of social engineering, basically running society like a highly efficient machine to produce and distribute goods and getting rid of messy things like politics in the process. So, how might a technocracy actually be put into practice? Well, one source points to the trillion-dollar biotech industry as a potential way to do it, but claims the whole effort is failing. This source argues that mRNA vaccines were supposed to be the flagship product, but they didn't stop infection. It also points out that Japan, which had the highest vaccine uptake, is now seeing the world's highest excess death rate. The source concludes that the industry's big push for deregulation now is really just a sign of desperation. You know, this whole idea of some kind of hidden control system, it's not exactly new. To give this discussion some context, the source material points back to this 1961 speech from President John F. Kennedy, where he actually warned of a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that operates in the shadows. It's a theme that keeps coming up in this analysis. So if a conspiracy like that existed, how would it maintain control? One source argues that the ultimate tool is blackmail, and it cites operations like Jeffrey Epstein's as an example. To really drive this point home, it presents this absolutely startling quote attributed to Nicole Kidman about the director Stanley Kubrick. The core assertion here is that powerful people are controlled through these secret networks, all bonded together by dark secrets that ensure nobody can ever break rank. So, wow, after peeling back all these layers, from a sputtering economy to a clash of global systems, and all the way to these really deep questions about control, we finally get to the end. What does it all mean when we put all these pieces together? Okay, so let's just recap the journey we've been on. We started with this surface layer, the symptoms, that widespread feeling of economic pain and instability. That led us to a diagnosis, a financialized Western economy based on scarcity. The consequence of that diagnosis is a stunning loss of production power on the world stage. And that finally led us to the deepest layer, these really provocative claims about the nature of the control system itself. And that leaves us with one last, absolutely vital question. The sources we've gone through paint a picture of a system in a really deep crisis, cracking under its own weight and its own contradictions. So the question for all of us to think about is this: if the old systems really are breaking, what's going to rise up to take their place? Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show. Okay, let's dive into this complex global landscape where economies are under pressure, conflicts are reshaping alliances, and powerful systems, both seen and unseen, are competing for influence. We're going to break this all down into 5 key parts to really get a handle on the forces at play. And we'll start right here at home with the economic pressures facing the United States. So, first up, America's economy. Let's take a closer look at what's really going on under the hood and some of the systems that are shaping our financial lives. To get started, one source from LouRockwell.com makes a really important point. We need to know our terms. A recession, it's a limited economic contraction. It's not the same as a depression, which is way, way more severe. Knowing that difference really helps frame the warning signs we're about to talk about. And that same source points to 3 classic red flags that the economy might be in trouble. Interest rate cuts to get people spending money, job losses because people just aren't buying as much, and of course, the government stepping in to try and juice the system. But, how does this pressure actually feel in our day-to-day lives? Well, writer Charles Hugh Smith has a really provocative way of putting it. He calls it a mafioso economy, built on, of all things, extortion. He uses an example that I think we can all relate to, the big shift from buying software to just renting it. Remember when you'd buy a program for a couple $100 and you owned it? Now it's a monthly subscription,
a perpetual rental that can end up costing you so much more over time. And this all leads to a huge question raised in an analysis from ShiftGold.com. Are the folks at the Federal Reserve caving to political pressure? The suggestion is they might be letting inflation run a little hot. And that has a ripple effect. It's making other countries nervous, pushing them to ditch dollars and buy up gold instead.
So, you can see, what happens here at home doesn't just stay here. These economic issues don't exist in a vacuum. Let's pivot to our second section and see how these tensions are playing out on the world stage. Wow, check this out. A report from the President's Daily Brief is highlighting a massive development in the Ukraine war. They've built a new missile at home that has an incredible range of nearly 2,000 miles that can reach deep into Russian territory. And the strategic importance of this is just huge. See, by building its own long-range weapons, Ukraine gets what's called strategic autonomy. It frees them up from all the political strings that can be attached when you're using weapons supplied by the West. Now, these tensions, they aren't just between nations. Sometimes they're right inside them. An article by Philip Giraldi in the UN's Review points to some controversial diplomatic appointments under the Trump administration, like Charles Kushner, as a reflection of its foreign policy. This move drew some really sharp criticism, with former Governor Chris Christie having called Kushner's case one of the most loathsome, disgusting crimes he'd ever seen. And just to put these global conflicts into some perspective, data cited by commentator Craig Murray offers a really stark statistical comparison. It highlights the vastly different proportion of child casualties as a percentage of total deaths in the conflicts in Ukraine versus Gaza. These geopolitical tensions, they're really driven by competing ideas about how the world should work. And that brings us to our third section, where we'll look at two very different global models, what one source calls the U.S. economy of scarcity versus China's economy of abundance. An essay in the UN's Review draws this really sharp contrast. It describes China's model as being all about production, R&D, and infrastructure. Meanwhile, it frames the U.S. model as one driven by financialization, basically making money from money, all to maximize returns for shareholders. And the numbers presented to back this up are pretty striking. China's shipbuilding capacity is said to be 240 times that of the U.S., and its share of global manufacturing, it just dwarfs its American counterpart. But here's a twist. Despite all this fierce economic competition, another source points out the lasting power of American culture. It notes how Donald Trump's brand of nationalism, for example, actually finds a receptive audience in places like Vietnam. It's fascinating. Okay, now we're going to shift gears. We're moving away from the visible worlds of economics and politics to look at what some sources describe as deeper, less obvious systems of control and influence. We'll go from established theories to, well, some more out there ideas. First up, a piece in The Expose defines this concept of technocracy. The idea is that it's a system that wants to replace messy politics and finance with a kind of scientific social engineering to run society. And then you have theories of control that are, well, a lot more esoteric. One source, for example, talks about a hidden history where these ancient aristocratic bloodlines have been secretly infiltrating and controlling global empires for thousands of years. Shifting to something much more recent, an article from The Expose takes a hard look at Japan's pandemic response. The source points out that Japan had the highest uptake of COVID-19 mRNA vaccines in the entire world, averaging about 3.6 doses for every single person. And then, the source connects that very high vaccination rate to Japan's correspondingly high number of cumulative excess deaths. The argument being made is that this represents a huge failure for the trillion-dollar biotech industry. This brings us to our final section, and it's a big one: the hidden costs of progress. It's all about digging into the unintended consequences and asking who really foots the bill for all this innovation and globalization. One of those costs, and it's a significant one, comes from our growing reliance on AI. Just look at this projection. The data centers that power all this AI are expected to triple their share of U.S. electricity use in just a few short years. That's a huge jump. And here's another debate highlighted by the show Breaking Points. It's about foreign students in the U.S. and weighing the clear benefits against the potential costs. On one side, you're attracting the best minds from around the world, but on the other, it raises real concerns about competition for jobs in spots in universities.
So when you tie all these threads together, from the economic squeeze at home and the conflicts abroad to these hidden systems of control, it really leaves us with one final crucial question. As our world keeps changing so fast and these massive systems keep evolving, who's actually paying the price for what we call progress? Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show produced and archived at the website notebooklmvideos.com.
Hello and welcome. Today, we are diving into a whole range of different viewpoints, everything from a massive power shift in the global oil market to the hidden costs that are making your next car, well, pretty much unaffordable. So let's get right into it. Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show. We're so glad you could join us today as we unpack these topics. All right, so here's what we've got on the docket for you today. We're going to kick things off with a major change in the global oil game, then jump into why new cars cost so much. After that, we'll look at a report on media narratives in Gaza, followed by a pretty challenging reevaluation of Winston Churchill. Then we'll explore an argument against contraception, and we'll wrap it all up with a quick roundup of headlines from the week. Okay, first up, we're looking at a piece from the Expos, and it argues that the world's oil refining industry is going through a massive, fundamental change, one that has some really huge geopolitical consequences. You know, the article really frames its entire argument around this famous line attributed to Henry Kissinger. The whole idea here is that the power to turn crude oil into useful stuff, gasoline, sure, but also the raw materials for over 6,000 other products. That power is a critical tool for global influence. So what exactly is this shift we're talking about? Well, the article highlights this really stark contrast. Over in the West, refining capacity is actually shrinking, but in the East, it's booming. We're talking China, India, and the Middle East leading the charge. This isn't just a small adjustment. The source says it signals a massive transfer of industrial power and really control over the entire global energy supply chain. And why is this happening in the U.S.? Well, the article points to a combination of things: tough environmental rules, a lot of political pushback, and the simple fact that it costs a fortune to upgrade these old facilities. In fact, get this, no new major refineries have been built in decades, and you're seeing more and more closures, like those planned out in California. And the sheer scale of this shift is just staggering. By 2030, we're looking at 181 new refineries planned to come online. But according to the Expos, the really crucial part is where they're being built. The vast majority are in Asia and the Middle East, which pretty much positions them to dominate the future of energy production. All right, let's switch gears, literally. We're moving on to the auto industry. An article from LewRockwell.com is asking a question that I think a lot of us are wondering about. Why on earth has the price of a new car just gone through the roof? The piece makes the case that we're basically hitting a wall financially. With prices this high, car loans are getting stretched out to 7 years, and that's just not sustainable. Now, the author suggests a key reason for these prices isn't just inflation. It's something they call compliance costs. So, what are these compliance costs? Well, the article is talking about all the features that are now mandated by federal law. And when you see the numbers they lay out, it's pretty eye-opening. They estimate that things like multiple airbags can add $3,500 to the price. That backup camera? $500. And these are costs that are passed directly to you, the consumer, but you never see them broken down on the sticker. And the end result of these sky-high prices is what the author calls a dangerous loan trap. To even afford a new car, people are signing up for these 7-year loans. The problem? Around year 4 or 5, the car's value can actually drop below what you still owe. You're underwater. And the article says people might just be forced to walk away from the loan. Okay. We're going to turn now to a very different and obviously very sensitive topic. Our next source comes from the UNS Review. It's an analysis from an author named Jonathan Cook about media narratives surrounding the conflict in Gaza. As always, we're just going to present the claims from the article as they are reported in the source. The whole article is centered around something it calls the legitimization cell. The author, citing what they say are Israeli intelligence sources, defines this as a special unit that was created to plant stories in Western media. According to the report, its purpose is to make military actions seem legitimate while discrediting journalists and other victims by trying to link them to Hamas. The author then goes on to outline a 3-step process that's attributed to this cell. Step 1, they claim, is to create links, even if they're fabricated, between Palestinian journalists and Hamas. Step 2 is to get these stories into Western media outlets, to create doubt and justify actions taken against the press. The ultimate goal, as described in the article, is to manage how the public in the West sees the conflict, which in turn reduces political pressure and lets military operations go on for longer. Staying with the UNS review, our next piece takes a critical look at one of the most famous figures in modern history, Winston Churchill, and specifically his leadership during World War II. This is the Churchill we all recognize, right? The defiant leader, the bulldog, the ultimate symbol of British resolve against impossible odds. His speeches are legendary, and they really define that whole era of heroism. But this particular article asks us to look past that iconic image for a moment. The source presents a completely different view of what the war's outcome meant for Britain. Instead of just focusing on the victory, it lists what it calls catastrophic results: the end of the British Empire, a national debt so massive it was crippling, the rise of the Soviet Union across Eastern Europe, and what the author calls a socialist straitjacket at home that held the economy back for decades. And here is the article's most explosive claim. It all centers on that pivotal moment in 1940 when Churchill decided to keep fighting. The source contends that right then, at that exact time, Churchill was financially ruined, and he was bailed out by a man named Sir Henry Strakosch, a very wealthy financier who was also a fierce opponent of Hitler. The piece suggests his financial tie created a potential conflict of interest that may have influenced the decision to fight on.
All right, our fifth topic today, also from LouRockwell.com, makes a historical and a moral case against contraception, arguing that it should be criminalized.
The article starts by pointing out just how fast society's views on this changed. It's hard to believe, but just over 100 years ago, in 1920, the Anglican Communion issued a really strong condemnation of contraception. Just 10 years later, though, they reversed that. Then you had the FDA approving the pill in 1960, followed by two huge Supreme Court cases that legalized birth control for everyone. It was a massive shift in a really short amount of time. To make its central point, the article uses this quote from C.S. Lewis. The author tries to frame contraception not as a simple matter of personal choice, but as a kind of power that the living have over future generations, the power to deny them existence in the first place. This is presented as the core moral objection. And for our last segment, we're going to do a real quick fire round of headlines from the newsletter Coffee and COVID. It's just a snapshot of the stories that have been making waves in their particular corner of the news world this past week. Okay, so here's a quick look at the headlines from their weekly digest. As you can see, the stories cover a lot of ground, from big changes at the CDC and HHS to calls for new investigations and some major foundations cutting ties with political funding groups. I'll just give you a moment to scan those. And that brings us to the end of our roundup today. Whew! We have covered a lot, from global economics and historical takes to domestic policy. It really just leaves us with one final question to think about. What is the value of considering these kinds of alternative narratives? Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show, produced and archived at the website notebooklmvideos.com. We'll see you next time.
So, what if I told you there's a hidden power that's been secretly shaping human history for, the last 10,000 years? It's a pretty wild claim, right? Well, today, we're diving into a set of sources that say exactly that. We're going to break down this alleged shadow empire from its ancient beginnings all the way to the unique spiritual solution they propose to fight back. Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show. All right, here's our roadmap for this journey. We'll start with the huge claim of a 10,000-year empire and really try to get inside the heads of its supposed rulers. Then, we'll look at the pretty dark methods of control they allegedly use. After that, things get a little more personal as we explore this concept of shadows, a problem they say lives inside every single one of us. And finally, we'll get to the spiritual solution the sources offer to fix it all. Okay, let's just jump right in. The central idea from our source material is absolutely staggering. It's the claim that a single hidden power structure, which it calls the Satanic Phoenician Empire, has been running things behind the scenes nonstop for 10,000 years? And according to these texts, this empire's reach is just massive. It supposedly kicked off 10,000 years ago, setting up shop in ancient power centers like Sumer and Rome. The source claims its influence just kept rolling through the Middle Ages, pulling the strings in places like Venice, and even directing groups you've definitely heard of, like the Vikings and the hordes of Genghis Khan. And now, well, they say its main hubs are in cities like London and Washington. And here you can see just how directly the source connects all these dots. It flat out asserts that historical figures like Genghis Khan weren't independent leaders at all, but basically field agents taking direct orders from a central command post in Venice. It even describes him as a Phoenician. It's a total rewriting of history as we know it.
So, if this empire is real, what on earth makes its rulers tick? What's their motivation? The source material tries to answer that by digging into their core philosophy, and it's this kind of inverted mindset that's apparently key to understanding everything they do.
This slide really lays out the fundamental conflict the source is talking about. You've got two opposing worldviews. On one side, you have a healthy approach to life, tied to morality and wisdom. But on the other, you have what the text calls oligarchical metaphysics, a philosophy that's described as a complete rejection of natural law, where you worship an evil god and literally train yourself to love what is evil and unlovable.
So, how does this twisted philosophy actually translate into real-world control? Well, the source claims that throughout history, this oligarchy had a specific toolkit. They'd supposedly bankroll brutal groups like the Vikings to act as their muscle and just smash their enemies. They'd cook up powerful myths, like the whole bloodline of Jesus story for certain kings, to make their puppets seem divine. And they'd use local worship centers to bend populations to their will.
Okay, now we're going to get into some of the really disturbing stuff. We're exploring the methods the source claims are used to control leaders inside this system. It details a whole process of ritual and psychological manipulation that's designed to guarantee absolute loyalty.
Now, the source is incredibly specific here. It defines Satanism not as some belief system, but as a set of actions. These rituals, and they list things like human sacrifice, torture, and pedophilia, are presented as a kind of technology. A technology used to systematically shatter a person's conscience, creating psychopathic leaders who are therefore completely controllable.
And blackmail is described as the central mechanism of control. It apparently follows a very clear escalating path. It starts by entrapping powerful people and videotaping them. Then, to prove their loyalty and move up the ladder, these people are forced to take part in rituals that get more and more horrific, which the source claims ultimately culminates in the murder of children.
And to argue that this is a repeating pattern throughout history, the text points to this number, 72. The claim is that 72 different empires have risen and flourished over time, only to be infiltrated and completely destroyed from the inside by this very same elite group.
So, after laying out this massive external threat, the source material does a complete 180 and pivots to an internal one. It argues that the real, true root of all this evil isn't the empire itself, but something inside the human mind that it calls the shadow. The text actually brings in this quote from the famous psychologist Carl Jung to frame the problem. The argument they're making is that while brilliant thinkers like Jung could identify and describe this shadow, they never offered a practical, step-by-step solution to deal with it. And that, the source claims, is the gap that it's here to fill.
Now, this is a really core concept. The shadow is supposedly made up of what the source calls shadow subpersonalities. Think of them like rogue programs or virtual machines running in your mind, completely cut off from any good or divine energy. To survive, they have to basically vampirize the energy of their host or of other people through all sorts of negative behavior. And the source claims that over many lifetimes, these things can grow in power until they just completely take over.
Okay, so after defining this massive problem, both on the outside with the empire and on the inside with the shadow, the source material offers a very specific solution. This last section is all about the proposed path to what it calls spiritual liberation. And the solution is laid out as this practical, 7-step process. It involves techniques with some pretty interesting names, like alchemical vitriol, which is described as a method for dissolving all that negative energy. The whole goal is to wipe out negative emotions, tap into spiritual energy, and fully integrate with your soul, which would, in theory, get rid of the shadow for good. And the promised results of doing all this? Well, they're pretty significant. The source claims that by following this path, a person can totally remove all their energy blockages, get rid of all the evil inside them, gain psychic powers, and even achieve enlightenment. And, interestingly, it also lists some very material benefits, like creating blooming health and walloping wealth. Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show produced and archived at the website notebooklmvideos.com.
Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show. So, what if the health advice we all follow, the stuff meant to keep us well, is actually the very thing that could hurt us when we get sick? It's a pretty wild thought, right? In today's Explainer, we're diving deep into a source that explores this exact question through a fascinating concept it calls Kumo's paradox. Let's break it down.
Here it is, right up front. This is the big idea from our source material. It's totally counterintuitive, but it's the heart of Cuomo's paradox. It basically suggests that when someone is seriously ill, the conventional rulebook for what's healthy might need to be thrown right out the window.
Okay, so what is this paradox really? Let's get into the core observation that this whole argument is built on. And here you have it. This idea just flies in the face of the one-size-fits-all advice we hear all the time. The source points to studies of patients with really serious conditions, think cancer or heart disease, where things we're always told are bad, like having some extra weight or higher cholesterol, actually seem to line up with better survival rates. Kind of makes you think, doesn't it? But here is where the source really flips the script. The author claims this isn't a paradox at all. Instead, it's a sign that we've got a fundamental misunderstanding of our own biology. And that whole reevaluation? Well, it starts with something we all think we know inside and out: cholesterol. All right, so let's tackle cholesterol, because the view in this source is a complete 180 from the standard medical guidance we've all grown up with. So you can see the two views right here, side by side. The story we all know is that high cholesterol is the villain, something to be fought and lowered at all costs. But this source presents a totally different narrative. It says cholesterol is actually the hero. It's a critical tool your body uses to patch things up, to repair damage, especially in our blood vessels. And this is the absolute crucial takeaway from the source's perspective. High cholesterol isn't the disease itself. It's a symptom that your body is in repair mode. It's a sign that healing is happening. Now, if you follow that logic, having low cholesterol when you're sick could actually be a bad thing. It might mean your body just doesn't have the raw materials it needs to fix itself. So you have to ask, if cholesterol is this amazing healing agent, why does it have such a terrible reputation? Well, the source claims the problem isn't the cholesterol. It's what happens to it when there's too much sugar in your blood. It points to this process called glycation, where high glucose from carbs actually damages the LDL cholesterol. And that damaged cholesterol is what can cause problems. So the takeaway here is that the real culprit isn't your body's healing response, but the diet that's corrupting it. Okay, so if an unnatural diet is the big problem here, what does a natural one actually look like? This brings us to the author's next major claim, all about our so-called species-appropriate diet. This is a big one. The source completely rejects the idea that we're omnivores. Instead, it says humans are obligate hypercarnivores. Now, that's not just saying we can eat meat. It's a much stronger claim. It's saying our bodies are biologically wired to thrive almost entirely on animal products. So this entire worldview is built on a few core pillars. First, that real, true human nutrition only comes from animal fats and proteins. Second, and this is a huge one, that all plant and processed foods are seen as sources of toxins that are constantly damaging our bodies at a cellular level. The conclusion, then, is pretty simple. Modern disease is the direct result of us eating against our biological blueprint. And this is how it all ties back to that paradox we started with. The source uses this dietary theory to explain it. The argument goes like this. An obese person who's at least eating some animal fats might actually have a better stock of the nutrients their body needs to heal than a skinny person subsisting on what the author calls a toxic, malnourishing plant-based diet. And the argument doesn't stop at biology and nutrition. The source goes a step further and makes some pretty bold claims about the history of modern medicine itself, suggesting its very foundation was built on a flawed, profit-driven idea. So, this historical narrative claims that way back in the 1800s, John D. Rockefeller saw a huge opportunity for profit in Louis Pasteur's germ theory. And according to this source, when the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research was founded in 1901, it cemented a whole new way of thinking about medicine, one focused on creating patentable drugs to manage symptoms rather than looking at the root dietary causes of disease. All right, so after this massive critique of everything from our diet to modern medicine, what's the solution? What's the path forward? Well, the source material lays out a very clear step-by-step path to what it calls true healing.
The method proposed is really quite direct. Step 1, get rid of the things seen as causing the damage in the first place. That means all plant foods, all processed foods. Step 2, nourish the body with its species-appropriate diet, meaning animal products. But here's a really key point. The source says to do this slowly, over about 8 to 16 weeks, to let your body adapt without a massive shock to the system.
So there you have it. We've just walked through a perspective that challenges, well, pretty much everything we think we know about health, from the role of cholesterol all the way to the history of modern medicine. It's a complete reimagining, all presented from the viewpoint of this one source.
Which really just leaves us with this one big, thought-provoking question to chew on. We've just explored a deeply challenging perspective. If the claims presented in this source were actually true, what would that really mean for nearly every single piece of modern health advice we follow every day? It's a pretty profound thing to consider. Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez podcast and video show produced and archived at the website notebooklvdeos.com.
All right, this week has been a whirlwind. We're looking at everything from secret peace plans and major global power shifts to some pretty startling new data on public health right here at home. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez Notebook LMvideos.com overview show.
Okay, let's kick things off with the big global flashpoints. The major theme this week seems to be conflicting signals, especially when it comes to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. What you're seeing in public? Well, it might not be the whole story. So you just heard President Trump there, and you can really feel the frustration, right? This was apparently just a week after his summit with Vladimir Putin. He's essentially saying, look, our talks are great, but then a bomb drops on Kyiv, and it just undoes everything. It paints a picture of a really strained dynamic, where the actions on the ground just aren't matching the words in the room. But here's where it gets really fascinating. While all that public frustration is playing out, a different source is reporting that a comprehensive peace deal is being discussed behind the scenes. It's called the Elmendorf Formulation, and the details are pretty specific. We're talking a peace deal first, then a ceasefire, Ukraine agrees not to join NATO, and even a territorial partition of Donbass and Crimea. In exchange, security guarantees and a gradual lifting of sanctions. It's a huge and definitely controversial potential endgame.
Okay, let's pivot now over to Latin America, where the administration is sending a very clear, very strong message. A naval force with 4,500 U.S. personnel has been deployed to the waters right off the coast of Venezuela. That is not a subtle move.
So why the big show of force? Well, here's the key. The administration has designated Venezuelan drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, this is a huge deal. It's not just a label. It unlocks a whole new toolbox for U.S. authorities, the kind of tools usually reserved for counterterrorism operations. We're talking freezing assets, disrupting their financing, and going after the leadership much more aggressively.
Meanwhile, the reports coming out of Iran tell two very different stories at the same time. Publicly, you have Supreme Leader Khamenei being completely defiant, dismissing any talks with the U.S. on their nuclear program. But privately, unnamed officials are suggesting Iran is seriously considering scaling back its uranium enrichment. The reason? To avoid getting hit with a new round of international sanctions. It's a classic case of public posturing versus private, pragmatic calculations.
Now, if you zoom out from these individual hotspots, you start to see a much bigger picture taking shape, and it's all about a fundamental shift in the global order. We're seeing reports that point to a decline in Western aid and, at the very same time, the strategic rise of Chinese influence.
Just take a look at this. According to a report from The Expose, what's known as official development assistance from Western nations is actually on the decline. And as you can see, nature abhors a vacuum. China is stepping right into that gap big time with its own cooperation funds, and the trend line is clearly rising.
But you have to understand, this isn't just about money or simple economics. Sources are detailing a much broader strategy here. China is reportedly leveraging its financial power and community connections to gain deep political influence, basically writing a playbook to shape policy and politics far, far beyond its own borders.
And this isn't just some abstract concept. We have a very specific example. A New York Times report lays out an alleged playbook for how Beijing operates in, of all places, New York City elections. The strategy is methodical. They mobilize these hometown associations, smear any candidates critical of the CCP, intimidate their supporters, and then funnel money and votes to pro-Beijing candidates.
All of this creates a really complex dilemma for U.S. policy. On one side, you have the administration arguing that they need to double Chinese student visas to keep American universities financially afloat. But on the other side, you have critics, including former advisors, who are sounding the alarm.
They're warning this dramatically increases the national security risk of espionage and intellectual property theft. It's a real tug-of-war between economics and security.
All right, let's bring our focus back home to the United States now, because there are some urgent debates happening here, sparked by some pretty alarming new public health data and a renewed fight over constitutional freedoms.
And when we say alarming, we mean it. Get this. A report highlighted on LewRockwell.com is pointing to a 3x increase in long-term disabilities among airline pilots since 2021.
And that's not all. In another deeply concerning trend reported by Coffee and COVID, infant mortality is actually on the rise in 24 states. That's nearly half the country. Now, for 25 years, that number was steadily improving, so to see that trend suddenly reverse is a really big deal.
Adding to this whole public health discussion, HHS Secretary RFK Jr. made a pretty stunning announcement. At a cabinet meeting, he said his agency is planning to reveal the causes of autism this September, and he directly suggested that a drug or something is responsible. A lot of people will be watching for that report.
Now, shifting gears from public health, a fiery debate over constitutional rights has been reignited. President Trump's call to criminalize burning the American flag has thrown the whole issue of free speech and the First Amendment right back into the spotlight. An article from the Rutherford Institute frames this whole debate as a form of political distraction, and it points directly back to the landmark 1989 Supreme Court case, Texas v. Johnson. This quote from Justice Brennan really lays out the core principle. The government can't ban an idea just because it's offensive.
So, the crucial point being raised here is this. What is the real danger? Is it someone disrespecting a symbol, a piece of cloth, or is it the government getting the power to chip away at the Constitution itself? The argument is that the focus should be on protecting the actual freedoms the flag is supposed to represent.
So, from secret peace deals in one part of the world to alarming health data and constitutional debates in another, we're just surrounded by conflicting narratives. It all leaves us with a pretty critical question to think about. When all the stories don't line up, how do we figure out what's really going on?
Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez Video Overview Show, produced and archived at the website notebooklmvideos.com.
All right, let's jump right in. We're going to take a look at a single, specific day and the stories that were shaping conversations. What can one 24-hour period really tell us about the world? Well, let's find out. Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez Notebook LNvideos.com overview show. For this explainer, we're going to anchor ourselves to one specific date, August 26, 2025. By looking at a whole bunch of reports all published on this one day, we can get a pretty unique snapshot of the ideas and narratives competing for our attention.
So we're going to unpack 7 different reports, and we've grouped them into 3 big themes. We'll kick things off with something really personal, the human body. Then we'll zoom out a bit to identity and history, and finally, we'll take a look at the big structures of power and politics.
So, Part 1, the human body. We've got 2 articles here that tackle this from, well, completely different angles. They explore our relationship with our physical selves, everything from how we try to perfect them to how we define the very moment they stop being. First up, we've got a personal blog post from Joachim Bartol. He's documenting his own fitness journey in his 50s, and his whole argument is that it's actually surprisingly simple to stay lean if you stick to what he calls a natural, species-appropriate lifestyle. So his method really boils down to 2 core ideas you see here. First, a diet he calls species-appropriate. For him, that means an animal-based diet. Think beef, lamb, eggs. And second, he uses what he calls strategic fasting, deliberately going without food for 36, even 38 hours at a time, which he believes enhances fat loss and healing. All right, let's shift gears for our second source. This one takes us from the world of personal health into a really complex ethical debate. It's an article by someone called a Midwestern doctor on LewRockwell.com, and it seriously questions the ethical lines in the organ donation system, starting with how we even define death itself. So the whole thing hinges on this concept of brain death. Medically and legally, it's defined as the irreversible end of all brain function. Now, this definition is what makes so many organ transplants possible, because it lets doctors procure organs while a machine is still keeping the body's circulatory system running. And to really drive this point home, the source brings up a pretty big philosophical question from a New York Times essay.
It suggests maybe we should shift our focus from total brain function to just the irreversible loss of higher brain functions. Consciousness, memory. It makes the case that that is when a person, not just a body, has truly ceased to exist. And this all leads to the central question the article is posing. With so many people desperately needing donor organs, should we expand the legal definition of death? The piece just leaves that question hanging out there, and it really highlights this profound tension between saving lives through transplants and the very ethics of how we define life's end.
Okay, let's move on to part 2. We're shifting your focus now from the body to these bigger ideas of society and history. We're going to look at some articles that really challenge the established stories about who we are and, where we came from.
Our third source, which is also from LouRockwell.com, covers some comments made by the podcaster Brett Weinstein. And, his argument is that the whole concept of multiculturalism, at least as it's practiced today, is actually fundamentally flawed and doesn't help build a cohesive society. So the core of his argument really hinges on this distinction you see here. On one side, you have what he calls Western cosmopolitanism, where the idea is that people from all different backgrounds come together, set aside their old identities, and work together to become one new people. But on the other side, he says multiculturalism encourages groups to stay separate and just maintain their own traditions in these isolated pockets, which he argues actually prevents a society from ever becoming one people. Sticking with that theme of observing society, our fourth source is an article by Donald Jeffries. It's a really personal essay where he just reflects on what he's been seeing in the workforce demographics as they change around the suburbs of Washington, D.C.
So really, the whole article is built around his personal day-to-day experiences. He lists off a bunch of different sectors, everything from government agencies like the DMV to retail stores, banks, even telemarketing, places where he feels like he's seeing fewer and fewer white employees. And that observation is what sparks his central question. All right, now let's take a step back into history. Our fifth source comes from the UN's Review. It's an article by Jared Taylor, and it pretty directly challenges the modern image we have of Abraham Lincoln. The author argues that Lincoln was a consistent advocate for racial separation, like throughout his entire political life. So this timeline here, from the source, really lays out the heart of the argument. It presents evidence that from his early statements in 1857 all the way through the Civil War, and even reportedly in a conversation just days before he was killed in 1865, Lincoln was always pursuing plans to colonize, which basically meant deporting, freed Black people to somewhere outside of the United States. The article uses this direct quote from Lincoln's 1862 address to a Black delegation to really hammer home the point. And what's interesting is how he frames it. It's not presented as a matter of right or wrong, but as a practical solution to what he called a physical difference, one he felt was causing suffering for both races. All right, let's move into our final section, Power, Politics, and Secrets. In this part, we're looking at 2 reports from that same day, August 26th, that deal with political power. One is about very public, overt actions, and the other focuses on these alleged hidden networks of influence. We'll start with a news summary from the Coffee and COVID blog. It's a really rapid-fire update on the big political headlines from the day. It gives us a real sense of the big political moves happening right out in the open. First, a pretty huge headline. President Trump fires the Federal Reserve Governor, Lisa Cook. And, the source points out this is a totally unprecedented move. The official reason given is an ongoing mortgage fraud investigation, which is then made even more complicated by new plagiarism allegations against her. The second big action reported is a couple of executive orders aimed at cashless bail. Basically, that's a policy that lets arrested people get released without having to pay money up front. And these new executive orders, they're designed to put a stop to that in Washington, D.C., and try to discourage it everywhere else by tying it to federal grants. And for our final source, get ready for this, we're diving into a really detailed investigative piece from the UN's Review by Alan Macleo. This article alleges that the Maxwell family, we're talking Robert Maxwell and his kids, has these deep, long-standing ties to Israeli intelligence and other agencies. And the scope of the claims in this article, it's pretty extensive, as you can see here. It's alleging this whole multi-generational network of influence. It claims the patriarch, Robert Maxwell, was a high-level spy for Mossad, that his daughters Isabel and Christine worked to push Israeli interests in Silicon Valley and big data, and that the next generation had roles in places like the U.S. State Department and British counterterrorism. So there you have it, a fitness plan, a debate over life and death, critiques of multiculturalism, observations on demographics, a historical rewrite of Lincoln, a couple of major executive orders, and an alleged spy dynasty, All of that from the reporting on a single day. It kind of leaves us with the question, in this daily flood of information, how do we ever figure out what is the signal and what is just the noise? Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez Video Overview Show, produced and archived at the website notebooklmvideos.com. Let's talk about allergies. You know, it's a strange thing. For one person, a bee sting is just a painful annoyance. But for someone else, that exact same sting could be life-threatening. That right there is one of the biggest puzzles in immunology. Why does our immune system sometimes learn the completely wrong lesson? That's the paradox we're going to dive into. Okay, so here's the real head-scratcher. When your body sees something over and over again, whether it's pollen, peanuts, whatever, it can go one of two ways. It can either get more sensitive, which leads to an allergy, or it can learn to just ignore it, and you build up tolerance. We're talking two completely opposite outcomes from the exact same trigger. How does that happen? That's the big question we're unpacking today. So, to really understand where things go wrong, we've got to start with the classic rulebook, the model of how our immune system is supposed to work. This is the basic idea that was taught for decades. And, you know, this isn't some new puzzle. This quote is from way back in 1906. Clemens von Purke, the guy who actually came up with the word allergy, was already wrestling with this. How can the very things that are meant to protect us, antibodies, also be the things that make us sick? It just sounds absurd, right? It perfectly frames the paradox we're digging into. All right, so let's get our terms straight. What is an allergy? At its core, it's just a massive overreaction. It's your immune system launching a full-scale war against something that's, well, completely harmless. We're talking about things like dust or cat dander or a protein in a peanut. It's a classic case of mistaken identity, happening at a biological level. The old-school way of thinking about this is the self versus non-self model. I want you to picture your body as a fortress. The immune system's job in this view is super simple. It patrols the walls and attacks anything that isn't recognized as self. Any foreign invader, no matter what, is seen as an enemy that has to be destroyed. And in this fortress, you've got soldiers on patrol. Two of the key players in an allergic reaction are these guys, mast cells and basophils. You can think of them as the guards at the gate, fully armed and just waiting for the signal that the fortress is under attack. So, how do these soldiers get the signal to attack? Well, it happens in a few steps. The first time you're exposed to something like ragweed, your body creates these little red flag antibodies called IgE. Then, those red flags stick themselves all over your mast cell soldiers. So far, no symptoms. But the next time you're exposed, the ragweed latches onto those flags. That's the alarm. The mast cells freak out and release a flood of chemicals, especially histamine. And those chemicals are what cause all the itching, the sneezing, the swelling, the whole miserable allergy experience. But here's the thing. That simple fortress model, as neat as it is, it really starts to fall apart when you look at how things work in the real world. In practice, the rules don't always apply. See, that straightforward process, allergen comes in, symptoms come out, it just doesn't tell the whole story. What if other factors could completely change the outcome? What if the context of the exposure matters just as much, if not more, than the allergen itself? Well, it turns out there are. These things are called cofactors, and they can be the real deciding factor between a mild reaction and a severe one. And they're things you'd never suspect, like going for a run, taking an aspirin, normal hormonal shifts, or even just having a drink. And get this isn't some rare fringe thing. In up to a third of all cases of life-threatening anaphylaxis, one of these cofactors is involved. Just think about that for a second. For 1 out of every 3 severe reactions, it's not just about the allergen. That tells us the simple equation of allergen equals reaction is missing a huge piece of the puzzle. So here's what that looks like in the real world. Let's say someone eats a shrimp and gets a slightly itchy mouth, or maybe nothing happens at all. But if they eat that exact same shrimp and then go for a run, the outcome could be catastrophic. The cofactor, the exercise, changes the entire game. It turns a non-issue into a full-blown emergency. The context is everything. And the plot thickens even more when we zoom out and look at our environment. It's not just about these immediate cofactors. Long-term exposure to stuff like heavy metals from pollution, chemicals and plastics like BPA, pesticides, and just general air pollution can actually change how our immune system gets programmed in the first place, making it way more likely to overreact down the road. Okay, so if the immune system isn't just a simple soldier guarding a fortress, then what is it?
let's explore a new, much more sophisticated way of thinking about its job. This timeline really shows you the evolution of these ideas. We started a century ago with just a basic fear of the body attacking itself. Then, in the 50s, we built that self versus foreign fortress model. By the 90s, scientists proposed the danger model, the idea that the immune system doesn't care about foreignness, it cares about damage. And now, we're landing on something even more nuanced, the immune system as an ecosystem manager. This changes the fundamental question your immune system is asking all day, every day. It's not a simple black and white choice between self and foreign. It's acting more like a manager, constantly gathering data and asking much more complex questions. Like, okay, is this thing actually causing any harm? What else is going on right now? What's the bigger picture here? And the evidence for this manager role is absolutely overwhelming. The old fortress model just can't explain any of this stuff. I mean, how can we live peacefully with trillions of foreign bacteria in our gut? How does a mother's body not reject a fetus, which is genetically half foreign? How can our so-called non-specific immune cells seem to remember past infections? The only way this makes sense is if you have a system that makes decisions based on context and benefit, not just on a simple us versus them rule. Okay, so if our whole understanding of the immune system is shifting this dramatically, it means we have to rethink, well, pretty much everything about allergies, how we prevent them, how we treat them, the whole shebang. Let's start with the famous hygiene hypothesis. The old idea was basically that our super clean modern lives leave our immune systems bored, so they start picking fights with harmless things like pollen. The new view is much more precise. It's not about being dirty for the sake of it. It's about a lack of diversity. Without being exposed to a really wide range of microbes early in life, our immune system just doesn't get the proper education it needs to tell the difference between a friend, an enemy, and a harmless bystander. And this realization completely flips the old advice for allergy prevention on its head. For decades, doctors told parents of high-risk kids to strictly avoid allergens like peanuts. But this new model suggests the exact opposite. The key isn't to hide from potential threats. It's to strategically introduce them at the right time and in the right context to teach the immune system that they're safe. Now, this isn't just a theory. A landmark clinical trial called the LEAP study put it to the test. And what they found was absolutely a game changer. Introducing peanuts early and often into the diets of high-risk infants didn't cause allergies. It dramatically reduced their risk of ever developing one. It's incredible proof that strategic exposure really works. So this new paradigm is pointing us toward a future of allergy treatment that's way more sophisticated. Instead of just blocking symptoms with antihistamines after the fact, the goal is to actively retrain the immune response. This includes things like oral immunotherapy, using tiny controlled doses of an allergen to build tolerance, and using things like probiotics to help cultivate a diverse, healthy gut microbiome that can better educate our immune cells. And that leaves us with this final question, which really sums up this whole shift in thinking. Do we see our bodies as sterile fortresses that are under constant attack from a hostile world? Or do we see them as complex, dynamic ecosystems that need to be carefully managed and cultivated? Because how we answer that question is going to shape the future of how we approach not just allergies, but our health as a whole.